Commercial flying isn't mysterious until it is. For most of every flight, systems do their jobs, checklists are checked, and every decision follows a chain of procedure that has been refined until the machine of routine hums, along with a kind of civil predictability. I've flown for years for Redacted, long sectors and short hops, domestic and international, thousands of hours that taught me to trust instruments, to trust people, to trust the tape and the numbers. I say that up front because the stories I'm about to tell aren't the frantic tales of incompetence or drama. They're quiet, precise, disorienting, and they happened inside that very machinery of trust. They're also my personal account, not an official statement from REDACTED Airlines. The dark secret, the thing pilots pass to one another in corridors on late-night coffee runs at industry conferences with a half smile, is simply this. Every so often, the sky behaves in ways our models, our radars, and our recorders don't anticipate. Not often, not routinely, but often enough that multiple crews across different fleets and routes have seen the same kinds of oddities. We document them, we log them, we tell a few colleagues off the record. We mostly do nothing dramatic because the job is to protect the people in our care and keep the airplane on its intended path. Still, we remember. If you find this interesting and want more first-hand aviation stories and investigations, consider subscribing. I share detailed accounts like this from the flight deck with the perspective of someone who's been there. To understand why these events stand out, you have to understand what normal looks like. Commercial aviation runs on redundancy and predictability. 2 pilots, multiple nav systems, ATC keeping traffic separated, TCS standing guard against mid-air conflicts, ADS-B and primary radar painting the sky for controllers, flight data recorders capturing our every parameter, and maintenance teams who patiently chase down anomalies. When something deviates, the first instinct is procedural. Cross-check instruments, confirm with ATC, consult maintenance, file the appropriate reports. Most surprises turn out to be sensor errors, software quirks, or human mistakes. Every now and then, however, you do the checks, and the systems are internally consistent. But the story they tell doesn't line up with anything on the ground. I'll start with one that, on paper, looks like nothing. A suitcase that didn't follow the rules. We'd flown a routine evening arrival. The aircraft was tired but compliant. Cabin secure, descent briefed, approach briefed. It's the kind of approach your eyes barely notice after years. Lights pass below, the runway comes into the field, and passengers settle into the sudden quiet that comes with touchdown. We rolled off the runway, taxied to the assigned gate, and called for ground. The gate agent was waiting, the jetway connected, en bloc confirmed. Passengers began to gather their things. A woman came up to the gate agent before she left the jet bridge, insisting her bag had arrived before we did. That's impossible, you think. Baggage systems are logged to the minute. Ramp cameras catch the conveyors, and the scanners record every ID tag. The gate agent escorted her back to the carousel, just to check. The bag was there, in plain sight. On the scanner readout, the bag had been scanned into the arrival system several minutes earlier, minutes before our on-block time on the flight log. The ground ops screen showed a timestamp that suggested the bag had been unloaded before the aircraft had physically stopped at the gate. We went through the motions we always go through with any discrepancy. I radioed ramp ops to confirm their logs. Ramp supervisors checked the CCTV for footage of their belt and the claimed unloading. The loadmaster went through the load sheet to make sure nobody had missorted tags. Everything checked out except for that timestamp. The belt camera showed the bag coming off a chute before our aircraft pushed into the gate area, but no other aircraft that could plausibly have delivered it showed up in the same sequence. The bag tag matched a seat assignment on our flight manifest. There was no evidence of human error in tag printing or scanning. We logged it as a data irregularity and added a note to the pilot's log and the aircraft forms for maintenance to review. The passenger was relieved to get her bag. She didn't want an explanation, only the result. From our side, there was no safety impact. The airplane was airworthy and uninjured, but the event lodged in the back of my mind like a splinter. It was small, tidy, and yet it suggested that the sequence of events we depend on, plane arrives, ramp unloads, had been violated in a single precise data point. I mentioned it at a crew room table the next day, more out of habit than a desire to alarm anyone. One of the new captains leaned back and said he'd seen something similar on a flight out of the Midwest. A passenger's medication appearing in the claim area before the plane pulled into the gate. Off-the-record stories like that are not rare. They cluster in the quiet places where crews swap experiences, and they're always described with the same tone. Factual, bemused, mildly unsettled. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. A few months later came something that pressed against a different set of assumptions. The idea that time, as recorded by our systems, is always linear and unremarkable. We were cruising at altitude over a sparsely populated corridor, nothing particularly memorable about the meteorology or traffic. Our flight plan was stable, the autopilot time-managed our descent to near precision, and we were passing one reporting point after another in the way we always do. On long flights, those waypoint calls become rhythmic. You watch progress across the displays, you mark off the minutes, you compare the ground speed and the predicted fuel consumption against the plan. In this case, a waypoint to waypoint segment recorded in the flight data recorder as having taken a duration that, when you did the math against the aircraft's performance and the winds aloft, didn't add up. It was as if the aircraft had covered a certain distance faster than was aerodynamically plausible, given indicated airspeed and ground speed, and simultaneously the ATC tapes showed timing that didn't align with what we saw in the cockpit. We noticed it during routine cross-checks. I called the first officer's attention to the ground track, and we replayed the segment in the operational cockpit log. The airplane systems were internally consistent. Altitudes, headings, engine parameters, all behaved as expected. There was no sudden surge of thrust. Fuel burn matched expectations. Yet the timestamps stamped in multiple places suggested a compression of elapsed time on that segment. We did the obvious things. We verified GPS integrity and compared the flight management system logs to the primary navigation sources. We asked ATC for any recorded deviations or ground radar echoes during that stretch. Controllers had nothing anomalous on their screens, but confirmed that their time-stamped handoffs didn't match the compressed timeline emerging from our side. Post-flight, the operations desk reviewed the flight data and said only that the segment was anomalous and had been logged for further review. We filed the standard discrepancy notation. No one broke protocol, no engines failed, no alarms screamed. What unsettled me wasn't a blinking light. It was the sensation, shared in the cockpit with the first officer's raised eyebrow, that a straightforward sequence of motion and time had folded in on itself somewhere between our instruments and whatever the ground was recording. Other pilots I've talked to have reported similar moments, a leg that feels a few minutes shorter than it should, or instrument timestamps that leave you doing double takes after the fact. Again, typically nothing operationally consequential resulted, but the cognitive dissonance was real. You begin to ask yourself, where do data and experience part ways? We move on, because flying is a ledger of priorities and safety margins, but those small fractures in expectation accumulate. Not all anomalies are passive. One evening, while established on a center frequency, we heard a voice that didn't fit into the tidy columns of the ATC chart. We were a few hours out, and the frequency was busy with routine position reports and altimeter checks. Then, plain as day over the same channel, a transmission came in identifying a call sign that matched one of our older tail numbers, one that had been taken out of service years earlier. The voice was crisp, professional, exactly the tone you'd expect from any crew. It asked for a position report and acknowledged a vector from ATC. The problem was that the controller listening replied that they had no radar return or ADS-B trace corresponding to that call sign, no primary contact either. The call sign matched a tail number that had been retired. It shouldn't have been transmitting at all. We listened to the exchange and heard ATC archive it as an unidentified transmission on their end. Our first officer, who had spent time as a relief pilot on a cargo route many years prior, muttered that it sounded like an old handbook phraseology, as if someone was rehearsing the script. I did what any cautious pilot would. I checked our assigned transponder code, verified our radio settings, and mentally cataloged the channels to ensure we weren't accidentally monitoring a different sector. Everything was set the way it should be. After landing, operations confirmed receipt of the controller's audio log. The tape contained the call, but no radar contact. The audio was put into the same pile where we'd placed the other oddities, logged, archived, and passed along internally for anyone who might have similar experiences. What was striking here was the convergence of human and machine accounts. It wasn't a ghost on tape with no human cadence. This transmission had the rhythm of an actual crew, yet the sensors that should have registered an aircraft did not. Pilots I've spoken to describe the same mixture of curiosity and unease. Curiosity because the exchange was so normal in tone, unease because normality and recorded reality diverged. Those first three incidents illustrate a pattern you begin to notice only after you've seen a couple of them. Anomalies that are precise, localized, and self-contained. They rarely force a diversion. They rarely endanger passengers. They leave behind a set of clean facts that nonetheless refuse to fit into existing narratives. Baggage scanned before the aircraft is on blocks, clocked flight segments that don't make sense, a voice on the radio tied to an identifier that should no longer exist. Each event is tidy enough to be documented, messy enough to be unexplained. In the crew room, conversation about these things follows an unspoken etiquette. We don't dramatize. We don't conflate anecdote with evidence. We document what we can. Times, positions, who heard what the instruments showed, what maintenance found, if there's anything to find. We file the minimum formal reports that keep the legal and safety boxes checked. Off the record, over coffee, we trade stories in a way that shapes a kind of collective knowledge, an awareness that pockets of airspace sometimes behave outside our models. The purpose of the restraint is simple and professional. Public alarm over an unproven phenomenon can lead to passenger panic, speculation that undermines trust, and pressure on crews to perform actions that could be unsafe. the culture tends toward tempering, not amplifying, any mystery. That culture also informs how we talk about risk. If your passenger is calm, your cabin crew can manage service and safety without distraction. If your passengers start hauling out phones and streaming live, you suddenly have another problem. A human factor event, layered on top of your technical situation. So there's a practical incentive to track quietly and to escalate only when there's a tangible safety concern. Sometimes the quiet decision is the right one for the public. Other times, that quiet becomes the reason we don't have a lot of public data about these phenomena. Because the incidents aren't all the same, the underlying tension grows. Small, explainable possibilities exist for every case. Scanner errors, human miskeys, maintenance databases out of sync, GPS anomalies, misattributed audio. But when multiple independent systems and independent witnesses align in documenting something odd, the anomaly moves from the trivial into the uncomfortable. Those moments force a choice in the cockpit. Pursue explanation in the moment, which can mean complicated coordination with ATC and interruptions to flight flow, or defer and document, preserving operational priorities, while giving the anomaly a later, more methodical look. We reached that junction again a few times over the next months. Some events blurred the line between oddity and the potentially hazardous, and those are the ones that stayed with me in the way only near misses do, vividly, quietly, with a sense of what we didn't do as much as what we did. One night over water, about halfway through a transoceanic hop, the cabin lights dimmed briefly to a more modern amber hue, and a companionable hum from the galley cut through the usual background. It was late, few passengers awake, and the sky outside was a blackness stitched with distant stars. The first officer radioed me that something was showing on the peripheral scan, a point of light off the right wing that seemed to be holding relative position. I asked him to confirm visually. He squinted and said there were actually 3 of them, deep blue in color and arranged in a formation that matched our track, pacing us. Those descriptors are imprecise unless you've watched an object on the rim of the night sky. The way a light holds a bearing, the sensation of it matching your airspeed and angle, the creeping awareness that the object is not a steady star, but is instead matching dynamic motion. When we called for a quick TKS scan, nothing. The ADS-B showed no returns in that sector. On our radar scope, there was 0. Primary radar would have shown something if the ground controllers had it tracked, but they had no contacts either. We tried to cross-check with nearby traffic advisories. Nothing. The lights continued to maintain a steady off-wing position, then subtly changed relative bearing as we maneuvered within our assigned airspace. We did what the procedures allowed. We didn't perform an evasive maneuver to chase a light for the sake of curiosity. That would have been irresponsible. We altered our angle slightly to get a better view from the flight deck windows and asked the cabin crew to look out for any light reflections. The lead flight attendant later told me in the debrief that the lights appeared as consistent, deep blue points that did not flicker like a reflection and moved in a way that was not immediately consistent with other aircraft. She avoided telling passengers anything that would create alarm. Her priority was to manage the cabin and keep everyone comfortable. After landing, we filed an operational irregularity report summarizing what we had seen. The time, the en route position block, our altitudes, general behavior of the lights, and the absence of radar ADS-B confirmation. Maintenance and flight ops archived it. Other crews on the same route chimed in later, off the record, that they had witnessed similar blue luminous objects pacing their aircraft on the same nights. Those corroborations changed the character of the event from a freak, isolated misperception to a recurring phenomenon with some traceable pattern. You can feel the tension ratchet up at that point. We remain committed to not jumping to causation. There are known benign sources that can masquerade as something odd: atmospheric luminescence, oceanic bioluminescence reflected at altitude under particular conditions, the odd behavior of airborne drones equipped with lights. But the persistent absence of sensor returns and the matching reports from multiple independent crews created cognitive pressure. Either multiple systems are failing in the same subtle way, or there's something happening outside our detection paradigm. And then there was the night that I still think about when I'm alone in a hotel room before morning departure, when the sky did something that felt less like a curiosity and more like an argument with everything I'd been taught about scale and motion. It began with a descent brief over a continental approach in the middle of a long, nocturnal sector. Weather was marginal in places, but not extreme. En route, we encountered a localized uniform red that seemed to grow across the horizon. At first it looked like the red glow of a distant city, or perhaps a bank of stratiform cloud catching the setting sun at an impossible hour. But then the red field thickened and took on texture, and through it we could see huge, slow-moving silhouettes, enormous shapes that moved like something moving underwater, rolling and undulating rather than flying. They were not on the radar. Their presence coincided with a severe, localized patch of turbulence that shook the aircraft in a way that made the cabin crew take immediate, brief control precautions. Passengers murmured. We called for a climb and deviation, breaking away from the red sector with immediate conservative action. After we were clear, the air smoothed. The red dimmed to ordinary night. We were left with the residual of something both visually extreme and physically unsettling. Colored fragments that rattled against the panes like jelly beans, hitting the nose and wings in small, adhesive impacts. Maintenance inspected the aircraft after arrival and found small, colorful fragments adhered to some surfaces. They were described to me as being like candy or plastic beads, irregularly pigmented and not consistent with known industrial debris. Maintenance took samples and filed the materials for evaluation. I never saw a definitive engineering answer. The occurrence was reported through the standard safety chain with a clear operational impact. The severe turbulence and the foreign object debris on the airframe required documentation and follow-up. That episode propelled the conversation beyond weird and into what-if territory. What if an aircraft continued through such a field without deviation? The worst-case thought, structural damage, compelled us to err on the side of caution, which is what we did. We told the cabin crew to secure the cabin, to have passengers seated and belts fastened. We deviated and climbed, and when it was safe, we declared the necessary maintenance inspections on arrival. The decision-making was prosaic and responsible. It had nothing to do with guessing the origin of the debris. But emotionally, for me and the crew, the experience felt bigger. It was not just a break in data. It was an encounter with scale and materiality that didn't fit the known catalog of airborne hazards. After that night, when I traded notes with colleagues in other fleets and other airlines, the stories came back more vividly. Colored fragments embedded in composites, unexplained red glows that coincided with severe upsets, blue lights that kept station. People told these accounts in careful, cautious tones because the last thing any of us wants to do is create fear where there's no evidence of systemic risk. But the accumulation of accounts creates a network of testimony that is hard to ignore. Individually, each report is a curiosity. Together, they begin to form a pattern. Clean, localized anomalies, rare but similar reports across different crews, minimal corroborative sensor data, and a professional culture that documents quietly and prioritizes safety and passenger calm over sensational disclosure. By then, I had learned a kind of professional humility that's difficult to teach. We fly machines built by brilliant people, monitored by precise instruments, guided by well-trained controllers, and yet all of that expertise meets the sky. An ancient, indifferent system that sometimes simply refuses to conform to our models. Recognizing that limit is not the same as claiming knowledge of cause. It's a practical acceptance. Our instruments are powerful, but not omniscient. Our procedures are robust, but not exhaustive. There exist scenarios that fall between the cataloged and the unknown. Those are the moments that define the dark secret. It's not sinister in a conspiratorial way. It's not that airlines or crews are hiding facts to mislead the public. The secret is quieter and more operational. Pilots at Redacted and across the industry know, from direct experience, that there are pockets of airspace that sometimes defy the neat relationships among time, detection, and causality that underpin our operational models. We keep the records. We file the reports. We act to protect the flying public. And between flights, we tell one another stories that begin to outline the shape of something unusual. If you're still with me, you've heard 3 of the 5 incidents that coalesce into this pattern. There are 2 more that pushed the envelope in a different direction, where the visual and physical sensations became even more immediate. The reports I've already described were enough to change how I thought about routine checks, data reconciliation, and the limits of sensor trust. They were also enough to make me aware of something else, the way crews instinctively choose containment over amplification. We do this for the passengers, for the system, and frankly for our own ability to function. But containment leaves questions. In the next stretch of accounts, you'll see the pattern deepen. The objects become more clearly observed. The physical impacts become undeniable. The behavioral pattern among crews, quiet logging, careful debriefs, and selective peer disclosure, becomes more pronounced. For me, those next incidents were the ones that required the most careful professional judgment and the clearest demonstration of protocol in action. They also forced an emotional reckoning. What do you tell your passengers? How loudly do you raise an alarm that could create panic? How much do you pursue an answer in the moment when the only safe choice is to preserve the aircraft's flight path and the passenger's sense of security? I won't suggest any final explanations here. I'll only say that the responses are governed by the same principles you see in every crew. Keep the aircraft safe, protect the cabin, and preserve the integrity of the operation. We don't embellish, we don't ignore, we document. And yes, we compare notes afterward in ways that create the kind of shared, unofficial knowledge that becomes the backbone of this secret. What follows next are 2 episodes that escalate the sensory intensity and push the operational boundaries in ways we hadn't yet encountered. They show how an otherwise routine profession responds when the scale of the unknown grows. The 2 episodes I'm about to describe didn't happen on my airplane. They happened to colleagues, captains and first officers I trust, people with the same training and the same procedural instincts I have. I'm telling them here because they pushed beyond the kinds of oddities we had already cataloged. One pushed the envelope on physical effect, the other on the scale of simultaneous corroboration. Both forced crews into the same professional balancing act. Act for safety first, preserve calm second, and document everything third. The first of these was relayed to me by a captain who flies long-haul sectors out of our transcontinental base. He's methodical in a way that makes other pilots relax. When he speaks, you can tell he's not dressing up a story for drama. He told me about an evening approach into a mid-Atlantic hub, where his aircraft encountered what he called, in the exact words he used over coffee months later, a wake that came from nowhere. They were established on final in visual conditions, stabilized approach, glide slope captured, flaps set, brief in hand. There was nothing unusual on the radios. Onboard systems were normal. The FMS tracking matched their intercept, and the captain had the runway environment in sight. The first officer was a professional young guy with steady hands, and the cabin report from the lead flight attendant was all calm. Then, very suddenly, the aircraft yawed, rolled briefly, and the control column was slapped with a force that felt like heavy wake turbulence. It was the kind of hit that wakes you up in a way an ordinary bump doesn't. The kind that immediately moves every hand in the cockpit to the primary flying tasks. In an ordinary wake encounter, you can usually point to a source. ATC will have traffic in front. You'll see a target on radar. You'll get a TCAS event or at least some spacing evidence. Here, there was none. The transponder returns were quiet. TCAS registered no targets. Ground radar had no indication of a preceding heavy aircraft. The hit produced enough deflection that the crew went through memory items to re-establish stable flight attitude. They called for an expedited vector out of the approach path, advised the tower that they had experienced unexpected wake turbulence, and declared they needed a moment to assess. Passengers were startled but not injured. The cabin crew secured loose service and did a quick walk to confirm no injuries. After landing, maintenance found a few minor surface marks on the lower fuselage and on a lower wing fairing that were consistent with a high-energy particle impact, or the scrubbing of something against the skin. Nothing catastrophic, nothing that compromised structure, but enough to require additional inspection before the next revenue flight. Those marks were photographed and logged with the normal, required thoroughness. What made this account stick in the memory of the crew, and why it spread among colleagues, was not merely the physical marks. It was the absence of a source. You can rationalize many things. A distant wake that wasn't shown on radar due to a transient radar attenuation, an unreported military sortie, or even a coordinated set of data dropouts across systems. But in this case, independent systems and witness testimony converged on the same stubborn fact. A significant aerodynamic disturbance with no discernible origin on the sensors that would normally explain it. That evening, the captain and first officer did exactly what we would all do. They prioritized flight control, minimized additional risk by declining to press the approach, and documented the event with timestamps, positions, and the maintenance findings. Operationally, they handled it by the book. Professionally, it raised the same internal question many of these events do. What if the source had been something larger, something we couldn't sense with our tools? The correct answer in the moment is always the same. Avoid further exposure, preserve the aircraft, and file the facts for later analysis. The lingering discomfort comes from realizing that even a small piece of debris or an invisible aerodynamic conflict can produce real physical effects in an otherwise well-understood system. The second incident came from multiple reports filtered through a group chat used by pilots across several carriers, an off-the-record peer network where we trade operational oddities and lessons learned. Over the course of a single night, crews on 3 different aircraft reported, independently, a sudden discrete zone in which multiple aircraft experienced anomalies in the same airspace block. The reports had remarkable overlap. Each crew was on a different route, but their tracks placed them within a common en route corridor within roughly a 30-minute window. Each crew reported one or more of the following: brief but significant instrument lag on certain displays, a transient loss or corruption of ADS-B reception for a short period, and visual confirmation by one or more crew members of luminous phenomena in the same general area. In one account, a first officer described watching a shallow, luminous ribbon cross beneath their flight path outside the window and vanish when they attempted to align for a better look. In another account, a captain noted that several tapes showed a small compression in elapsed time, a notch in the recorded timeline that didn't square with the flight plan. Ground controllers in the sector logged an unexplained event and echoed requests for more data, but provided no definitive explanation. What matters here is the simultaneity, multiple independent crews, multiple systems, and even a few passengers who later posted grainy photos that captured only vague, colored streaks, all pointing to an anomaly concentrated in a narrow slice of the sky for a finite, short duration. These weren't prolonged disruptions, none escalated into formal emergencies, but because the reports coincided, ops departments and a few engaged investigators took extra care to preserve the data. Radar tapes were duplicated, ADS-B logs archived, maintenance inspections ordered where appropriate. It was clinical, methodical work. No theatrics, no sensational press releases. From a professional perspective, that simultaneity changes the calculus. An isolated occurrence can often be explained away as a sensor hiccup or human misperception. Repeated, coincident observations across platforms are harder to dismiss. Pilots respect corroboration. It's part of the culture of verification that keeps us safe. But even with corroboration, the response remained conservative. Additional logging, targeted maintenance, and a quiet, practical note circulated among crews. Document thoroughly, prioritize safety, and keep the public informed only to the extent required by safety authorities. That night's cluster of reports produced an internal conversation about thresholds for escalation. What conditions should prompt immediate, broad reporting to higher authorities? How do you avoid mass public alarm while ensuring safety regulators have enough information to act if there is something systematic? Those are important questions, and they get debated in our safety committees in language that is technical and unglamorous. The conclusions are always procedural. Collect data, preserve evidence, treat passengers and crews with the priority they deserve, and escalate if there is a clear, reproducible threat. Taken together, the episodes I've described, my own, ones I witnessed, and ones told to me by trusted colleagues, begin to sketch the outlines of the secret we carry in our community. It's not one single type of phenomenon, and it doesn't behave consistently. What unites these episodes are a few recurring traits. First, the anomalies are precise and local. They occur in a limited space at a limited time, and they don't cascade into wide-scale system failure. That's a crucial reason why they rarely force the kind of immediate public action that would attract mass attention. A single bag scanned early, a compressed timestamp here, a voice on a frequency there. Each anomaly is compact enough to be contained. Second, the anomalies leave clean but puzzling traces. Data exists, reports exist, maintenance records, audio logs, and handwritten notes and flight decks accumulate. It's not that nothing was recorded, it's that what was recorded doesn't fit neatly into the categories our systems were designed to explain. That mismatch is what gives rise to the dissonant impression, machines and people telling two slightly different versions of the same moment. Third, and perhaps most important, is the cultural response. Pilots are trained to prioritize the immediate, practical needs of flight safety over curiosity. If a phenomenon doesn't represent a clear and present danger, we tend to document it and move on. There are a few reasons for that. One is human factor management. If passengers are calm, cabin service can continue without distraction. Flight attendants can secure the cabin and prepare for contingencies. Another is systems reliability. Chasing an explanation in the middle of flight can create risk if it compels unnecessary maneuvers. A third is reputational. Inflating uncertain events publicly can generate fear rather than information, and fear undermines the very safety environment we're tasked to preserve. This discretion has costs. For one thing, it means the public record is sparse. We keep internal logs that can be rich with detail, but those logs are often classified as operational irregularities or maintenance reports and rarely make it into public databases unless there's a legal or safety reason. For another, it shapes the way pilots tell stories, cautiously, with hedging language, with lots of we don't know and we can't say. That cautious language frustrates listeners who want definitive answers, but it protects the integrity of the operation and avoids giving the impression that speculation equals safety guidance. Over time, what accumulates in crews' shared memory is less a theory than a posture, a recognition rooted in experience that our models are powerful but incomplete. We trust instruments because they are generally reliable. We trust human procedures because they are tested. But we also accept that the system meets an environment, the sky, that has not been designed to conform to a human script. That's a form of humility. And it's the honest core of the secret I keep referring to. There's an emotional texture to that humility that is easy to miss. In the cockpit, it looks like quiet vigilance. You don't see melodrama. You see attention focused on checklists, on fuel, on altitudes. You see crews who will go out of their way to reassure passengers if things look odd, because trust is a fragile commodity at altitude. You also see pilots who, when off duty, will trade stories in a way that is matter of fact. I logged X, ops archived Y, as if speaking plainly about the unknown makes it less threatening. I want to be careful here about what I'm not saying. I'm not asserting a cause for any of these events. I'm not suggesting institutional malfeasance. I'm not offering definitive proof of anything beyond a set of correlated experiences. I am stating what I know from years in the flight deck and from the accounts of colleagues with good reputations, that rare anomalies occur, that they sometimes have physical effects, and that the industry response is to document and to prioritize safety while avoiding public alarm. That combination of facts is what gives the phenomenon its peculiar quality, an acknowledged uncertainty contained within a culture of restraint. If you're wondering what this means for you as a passenger, the practical answer is simple and reassuring. The vast majority of flights are governed by predictable systems that work extremely well. The anomalies I've described are rare and, in most cases, non-threatening to the structural integrity of the airplane. When an event escalates to the point of actual hazard, Procedures are clear and crews act decisively. Secure the cabin, communicate with ATC, divert if necessary, and get maintenance and inspections performed. Many of the stories I've told ended without injury or lasting operational compromise because the pilots and cabin crew did exactly that. There's also an ethical dimension to how we talk about these things. Pilots carry a responsibility not only to share information that can improve safety, but also to avoid seeding unnecessary fear. That balance is why a lot of these experiences sit quietly in crew rooms and debrief logs instead of in headlines. It's simultaneously frustrating and, from a professional standpoint, rational. When I reflect personally, I find that the accumulation of these episodes has changed nothing about my commitment to aviation and everything about my attitude toward the unknown. I still pre-flight with the same checklist rigor. I still brief for contingencies with the same conservative mindset. I still trust the instruments. But I do so with a softer certainty, an understanding that our instruments are reliable within a defined envelope, and that occasionally the environment will present boundary cases our tools weren't built to explain. There's also a kind of moral clarity in that stance. The duty of the crew, our highest directive, is to safeguard the people under our care. That obligation shapes every decision, not chasing spectacle, not amplifying uncertainty into panic, and always documenting for the sake of possible future learning. The secret becomes less about concealing phenomena and more about protecting the operational environment that makes air travel safe for millions of people every day. This is why pilots at Redacted and across the industry do what they do. We log, file, and share selectively. We advise peers. We push data to the channels that can use it: maintenance, ops, and safety investigators. Occasionally, when patterns become clear enough to warrant broader attention, those channels act. But for the most part, the collective response remains the same: measured, cautious, and professionally discreet. Now, if I step back and try to say what the sum of all this experience teaches me, it's two things. First, be humble in the face of an environment you don't control. Flight is a partnership between human skill and engineered reliability measured against a sky that predates both. Second, be meticulous in what you record. Data matters. A single odd timestamp, a fingerprint on a fuselage, a maintenance log with a photograph. Those fragments are the building blocks of any eventual explanation. If you're watching this and you have your own story, something you saw from a passenger window, a grainy photo that doesn't make sense, or an experience that left you puzzled, please share it in the comments. Real learning starts with accounts that can be cross-checked and archived. And if you're interested in more first-hand aviation stories with the perspective of someone who's sat in the left seat for decades, subscribe and I'll bring you more accounts, always with the emphasis on careful reporting and professional context. In closing, let me tie this back to the title: The Dark Secret. Every pilot knows about Redacted Airlines. The phrase dark secret reads punchy on a thumbnail, but the reality is quieter and I think more important. The secret is not that someone is hiding something sinister. The secret is that crews know there are limits to our models, pockets of airspace where events occur that do not conform to the neat categories our instruments provide. We don't dramatize it because dramatizing would be both irresponsible and unhelpful. We document it because facts matter. We share cautiously because safety and calm are paramount. I still fly. I still sleep enough to do the job. I still brief my crew with the same clarity and trust. But when something odd happens now, I file it with the care it deserves, and I keep the perspective that has kept aviation safe for generations. Act with prudence, protect the people, and let the data find the answer in time. If you've experienced anything like what I've described, or even something that feels related, leave a comment below. I read them, and they help build the mosaic of first-hand accounts that, over time, may point us toward better understanding. If you want more of these kinds of stories and methodical investigations from the flight deck, subscribe. Thanks for listening. Fly safe.